I'm going to spend a few minutes in this movie talking about the various different file formats that you might run into when you're working inside Photoshop and need to send that file somewhere else. For instance, a page layout application or an email, or you want to put it on a website or something like that. Whenever you work inside Photoshop, whenever you open a file, regardless of what file format it is, when you open the file, it always gets converted into a Photoshop document while you're working on it. We call that the working file. So if I show you the explanation for PSD, you'll see it's the working file. It keeps all the layers in a particular document. So all the type layers or layer masks or channels and paths and things like that. It keeps everything that you may have done inside that file. And this is why we call it the working file. Because if you ever want to go back and modify any of those particular layers or settings that make up the document, you would want to go back to the layered file so you could go back and get to those layers. Any other file format that you're going to choose from, or at least almost all of them, will end up creating what we call a flattened version of it, a flattened file, where all the layers get compressed or collapsed into a single layer and then saved into a different file format. So for instance, if I were to go to File, Save As right now and choose a different file format other than Photoshop, other than .psd, any option I choose here, whether it's JPEG or GIF or PNG or whatever, you'll notice that the layers checkbox here is grayed out, which means I can't save the layers when I choose the JPEG file format. It also tells you that if you choose something other than a .psd, it's going to be saved as a copy. So again, that's just a way to protect the original layered file from being saved over, and also because you're choosing a different file format that doesn't support layers. So PSD, again, is the working file. If you want to send your file to an online photo service, or you want to compress it to send it to in an email to someone, or to put it up on a website, you have two file formats to choose from. The first one is JPEG, JPEG, and the file extension is either .jpg or .jpeg. And this is a lossy file format, which means it loses information when you save it as a JPEG. It compresses the file to make it smaller, and in compressing it, it throws away information. So you really only want to save something as a JPEG one time. And that's why you keep your layered Photoshop file. If you need to make a modification, you go back to the layered file, make your change, and then resave out a new JPEG with probably the same compression settings you used the first time. When you reopen a JPEG and then resave it back out as a JPEG again, you will be compressing the file again. Nothing happens to the JPEG if you're just opening it. It's only if you want to go back and save it again, you'll be recompressing it a second time or a third time, depending on how many times you do this. So one other note about that is when most of you are taking digital pictures with a digital camera, more often than not, the pictures you're capturing that are ending up on the camera, the memory card, are being shot or saved in JPEG. So they take up less space on the actual card, so you can take more pictures. When you copy them to your hard drive, when you're working with the file and you're going to do modifications to it, again, if you're going to do lots of modifications, you want to save the working file as a layered .psd, and then your final version of that you could save back out as a JPEG one time. So there's that. Again, to save this as a JPEG, you would just go to File, Save As, choose JPEG as your file format, and then once you do that, if you chose JPEG, most file formats that you choose from will bring up a secondary dialog box that gives you options for that particular file format. So for JPEG, you get the ability to set a quality setting, how big the file will be. And there's a slider here for small versus large. If I make it very, very small, the file size is going to be a lot smaller. It's only be 19K, but the image quality is going to be horrible. And you can see in the background here, the text is just getting mangled. It's giving you a preview of what that's going to do. So again, typically if you're saving digital photographs and you want to make them archival, just make them as small as possible, but keeping all the quality. You would choose the largest setting, so quality of 12. And again, just do that one time. We'll go ahead and cancel that. The next file format for the web would be the GIF file format. And this is also a lossy file format because the loss happens before you save it. In order to save something as a GIF, you have to convert it into what's called an 8-bit graphic. And basically 8-bit means you can only have 256 colors in the file. Or less. So this is typically used for not photographic images, but for graphics. So a logo or text on a dark background, light text on a dark background or something like that. Your interface elements. Something that has a lot of contrast in it. So line art and things like that. You would convert, I'm not going to show you how to do that right now, but you would convert this into an 8-bit graphic, or you choose a color table that has 256 colors or less in it. And then you would save that as a GIF. So if you're going to the web, you really have two file formats, the JPEG or the GIF. JPEG is typically used for photographs. GIF is used for graphics. Both of them are an approximation of the original file. You'd want to keep the working PSD. In any case, in any file format you choose, always keep that layered Photoshop file around in case you need to change your mind. The next file format that you might run into is the PNG file, or PNG. And most of you probably won't be using PNGs all that much. They are especially good if you're taking graphics and taking them into Flash, Macromedia Flash, because it is a file format that does support transparency. Again, we'll talk more about transparency and what that means in the layers chapter later on in this title. But for now, if you've got an image on a transparent background and you want to save that transparent areas instead of them turning into opaque white, the PNG file format does support that, which is why if you want to take a layered Photoshop file or an image that has a transparent background in it into Flash and maintain that transparency, PNG is the file format that you would choose. If you're going to a print application, something like InDesign or Quark, you have two file format choices there. One's going to be either EPS or TIFF. I'll get to TIFF in just a second. For EPS, basically EPS stands for Encapsulated PostScript File. And really what that means, it's a black box, which means you can't touch it once it's been generated. You can't modify what's inside the EPS file. So that's why a lot of service bureaus or a lot of IT people like EPS files, because when you place them into InDesign or Quark, they can't be damaged, they can't be touched by the designer inside the page layout application. All you're really placing in the page layout application is a small JPEG preview of the larger file, and these EPS files cannot be modified. You can scale them and transform them, rotate them, things like that, but you couldn't, let's say, apply a color to them. All that type of editing would need to be done in, say, Photoshop. And then when you save it as an EPS, it's basically being printed in advance, being printed to a file, and then a JPEG preview is putting in front of that file, and that's what you're actually placing in InDesign or Quark. The preview just shows it up on the page, and it's pointing to the already printed file on your hard drive. And then when you actually do the print command, it goes out and gets that EPS file and sends it to the printer. So if I were to go File, Save As, and choose EPS, again, like a lot of these other file formats, you'll get a secondary dialog box that comes up that says, EPS options. You can have a high-resolution preview, a TIFF, or it can be a JPEG. If you're on a Mac, you can choose the JPEG format. Again, this is just the preview of the file that you'll place. Okay, go ahead and click Cancel. Last file format that you might run into, again, for the majority of you, is that second file option for print workflows, and that's TIFF. This is a little bit more flexible, or a lot more flexible than EPS files, because you can modify them within the page layout application. You can, say if it's a grayscale TIFF file, you can apply a spot color to it in the page layout app without having to go back outside of Photoshop to do that. So a little bit more flexible. Some people think that's a good thing. Some people think that's a bad thing. Just depends on your perspective. So these are a summary of the file formats you'll most likely run into as a basic beginning Photoshop user. Again, the PSD file is the working file. JPEG, probably the second most common file format that you'll run into, because it's, for a lot of you, that's the file format that you're starting out with. And just keep in mind that if you're going to be doing lots of editing, especially during different sessions, you would want to save out a PSD from the original JPEG, and then you can go back and save a JPEG when you're all done.